Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV and the concluding part of Codes and Codebreakers Week. Although, of course, we have been touching on SIG, INT, and other aspects within that area. So we're going to start with a bit of a presentation about Ultra, which we touched on with David Kenyon and other shows, but then we're going to open it up to questions from you folks who are watching. Everybody knows my guest tonight, David O'Keefe, is something of a regular on World War II TV. He's been busy teaching. That's why we're starting a bit later, which means I'm having an adult beverage. And there's a bit of a sad, this is my last English beer. I don't know where my stocks are going to come from anymore. It's a sad day of mourning in the World War II TV household, but I will enjoy this one now. So anyway, here we go. Without further ado, David O'Keefe, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Woody?
I'm all right. So Ultra. So we've flashed out that there are various organizations working around the world for the same effort of understanding and taking information from the enemy that could be used for the war effort. But Ultra is a more kind of specific part of it within that field. We'll open up to questions there. But I think one thing I want to say about the week is I've been really surprised about how, well, not surprised, that sounds like I think my audience are idiots, but I've been really gratified that the sidebar comments, people really have an interest in codes. They have a deep knowledge and understanding of it. And I wasn't really sure how this week was going to go, because I know people like to talk about battles and tanks and guns and stuff. And yeah, I've been really pleasantly surprised. So within your field, teaching as you do about history, how important is it to you to get across this whole aspect of the intelligence role within World War II? Has it been difficult to get it into the mainstream academia, because has the focus more been on the politics, or what's your feeling?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, when we start getting into this, I'm going to talk a bit about the historiography of the revelation of Ultra. The way I approach it, of course, is that I'm not necessarily involved with the technical end of code breaking. What I've always been fascinated about as a military historian is the actual application of the information, the intelligence that they use, and its impact on decision making. So that's exactly what we're going to take a look at today. And today really is kind of an introduction, if you will. We're going to sort of take a look at what Ultra was, the historiography of Ultra, and going to take you through some of the actual messages and show you how to use it. So using it kind of as an introduction for young historians or people who are historically inclined and minded to, perhaps take a different approach to re-examining battles. And that's really what this was all about.
I mean, we'll get into historiography later on, but I suppose because people of my age group who started reading in my teens, I was reading books that were probably already 10, 20 years old when I was reading them. So I grew up when the real understanding of this aspect of the war just wasn't being written about. The people who actually been involved with it knew what they'd been doing, but they were keeping stum because they were specifically told to. So I suppose for people of my generation, it's been a bit of an odd thing to accept that this has been a part of the history, because so much of my early reading just didn't mention it. And so in a sense, we're playing catch up now, because as we've talked about this week, we've been writing about the Battle of Britain since the Battle of Britain was actually taking place in the skies over England, as we have other battles. But this whole intelligence battle has really only been talked about for, 3 decades, I suppose?
I would say 3 decades. In other words, the revelations came out in the late 1970s, and then there was an initial release of material. And everybody rushed, and this is the thing. Everybody rushed out and said, oh my God, this is going to, change everything we know about the Second World War. And the British government got cold feet real quick. They realized, we have opened up a Pandora's box, and we cannot really control the narrative anymore, or the narrative is going to completely spin off the wheels. Not so much that they're controlling it, but the fact that it could completely open up a whole different series of issues. And also, you are dealing with some of the most relevant forms of intelligence that we have in this day and age. Signals intelligence explodes onto the scene in World War II. It has its origins in World War I. And then, of course, now, if you take a look around, GCHQ, NSA, CSEC or CSE here in Canada, they are, as far as we know, the greatest or the most highly funded of any of the intelligence agencies. So all this explodes onto the scene. And of course, the British got very uptight in the late 70s, early 80s, when everybody, the entire historical community rushed to it, thought, oh my God, everything is going to be rewritten. So that's when they put the brakes on. And they went from actively trying to dissuade people from writing about their experiences and exposing various things to then reluctantly agreeing to release some material. But the problem is you have millions of pages of material that was created during the war, particularly on ultra and signals intelligence from the Second World War. And what the British did is they only released a few thousand pages. So, of course, you can imagine the train went to a staggering halt very quickly, historiographically speaking. And suddenly all the historians said, well, come on, there's nothing here. This is nothing more than a white elephant. Well, some would argue that that's exactly what they were hoping to do by slowing the process down dramatically. And then relatively quietly in the mid-1990s, it was actually the Clinton administration, from my understanding, that just basically signed 50 years at the end of World War II, let's declassify everything. And so the NSA started declassifying en masse a lot of their signals intelligence material and putting it into the archives in the States. And Great Britain felt they had to follow suit. So they did, but they did it quietly. And they started releasing material starting in 1995. Again, I've used this in connection with Dieppe, the idea of a box and a series of puzzle pieces. And so every year more puzzle pieces are revealed. And now if you go to the British National Archives and you type in the HW class, which is associated with GCHQ, you'll have something like around 15 or 16,000 files, not to mention millions and millions of pages. And that's just in the HW class, which is GCHQ. You have plenty of, thousands of pages or tens of thousands of pages more on the air use of it, Admiralty files, War Office files. And then, of course, Canada has released some of the stuff that they were doing. So it really now is, believe it or not, all these years later, starting to live up to that original hype with this long intermission. In other words, if you are a historian, a young historian, or any historian right now, and you're dealing with World War II, you have to consult what is in Ultra or what is involved with Ultra to really get an understanding of what is going on in the commander's mind, particularly if you're doing military or battle history, if you will.
And that's a good sales pitch for a show on Ultra, that you've got to be studying it. So let's talk about some of the language and terms we're going to use. It's always good to kind of prepare the audience because we have these expressions: top secret, extra top secret. I can't help thinking of the film Animal House with the double secret probation. So
double secret probation, yeah, exactly.
So run us through some of the terms.
Well, it kind of starts off that way. I mean, it was always called by the Americans and by the British, particularly the Admiralty, special intelligence. And then later on, because of the fact that it was extremely sensitive and extremely revealing, it went up to very special intelligence, or sometimes referred to MSS, most secret source. Of course, Churchill, whenever he dealt with it, and he used to have deliveries in a box every single day of the latest Ultra headlines because he absolutely loved this stuff. He called it Boniface. In other words, he blamed it on an agent called Boniface, who was uniquely positioned everywhere to see everything. And so you will see later on, I have one of the examples of the message that he sent out into to Montgomery, I guess it was, in Tunisia. And it says Boniface information. And he refers to it during the war as Agent Boniface. And the idea was for security purposes, just in case his messages were intercepted, the Germans would then assume that this was some sort of high-placed agent, and they would not suspect that their codes and ciphers had actually been penetrated. Now, how successful that was, I don't know. We haven't really seen too much on what the Germans are doing. We have some, but there's still some stuff that would have been destroyed by the end of the war from the German perspective. We end up getting then a top secret classification because, of course, this is beyond, it's not just secret, not just most secret, but actually beyond top secret. So they would call it top secret ultra. The Americans also had another term, which you'll see every once in a while in the files, called Zymotic. But that usually they refer to it as just Z. And then, of course, it was ultra top secret. And then finally, they referred to it simply as ultra. And that was the final stamp. So basically, you see it as special intelligence in the first couple of years of the war. And then by 1941, they're starting to call it ultra. When the Americans come in, then pretty much it's ultra. And so essentially, anything and everything that they deem sufficient from a security perspective to be put under ultra is put under ultra. And that's everything from all forms of signals intelligence, cryptography, etc., all the way down direction finding, traffic analysis, radio fingerprinting, the whole kit and caboodle. But more importantly, anything and everything related to that. So any kind of assessments that are based on this, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're talking about, specific codes or ciphers, but anything that the enemy may be able to tap into to say, hey, our codes and ciphers have been broken. Anything and everything is lumped under the title ultra. And that's sort of, that of course penetrates the psyche. There were plenty of books written about this. The term ultra was used in the 1970s with Frederick Winterbottom, as you can see right there in the middle and the bottom. And this is kind of the progression. There were whispers about the Enigma machine, the capturing of Enigma machines, the penetration in Polish works. Code breakers, even David Kahn in 1967 had mentioned the capture of an Enigma machine, but really didn't go into depth. And then, of course, there was the French one by Gustave Bertrand, which basically outed everything, or at least outed the French involvement with this. And then Ladislav Farago had mentioned something along those lines in the splashy Game of Foxes. But what really went off the charts was in 1974 with Frederick Winterbottom. And Frederick Winterbottom was actively dissuaded by the British government from publishing this. As a matter of fact, he was pretty angry about it, and he appealed to them. And he said, "Look, these other books have come out. The secret, if you will, is out to a degree." And he said, by the very nature of what I did, which was basically head up the SLU network, the Special Liaison Unit, which was responsible for security of Ultra, he said I could be pretty judicious in how I deal with it. But either way, this has come out. So he ended up writing this, and I believe it was serialized in one of the big papers in the UK. I'm not sure if it was the Telegraph but anyway, it was serialized. It was huge. It was splashy. And that was the one that kicked open that whole idea that the entire Second World War will be written, and it'll be written overnight or rewritten.
Not directly related, but this is also the late 60s, early 70s is the golden era of all the spies writing their memoirs. This is the post-Bond book, post-Bond movie, height of the Cold War, where everybody was interested in spies and subterfuge and secrets and all those Len Dayton and Jack Higgins and all Frederick Forsyth. This is that 15-20 year period that was just the halcyon days for anything that involves secrets, and so it's no wonder that this is the period in which these books start coming out, coinciding also with the people who were involved in the war getting to retirement age, thinking about their pensions, getting books out. There's lots of things involved in historiography that we need to kind of reflect on when we look at when and how these books came about in the specific era they did.
Yeah, I mean, the economic imperative is there. I mean, Winterbottom did it for the money, and he is unapologetic about that. And, he knew that this was going to be a bestseller. And sure enough, it was. I mean, it, not only did it, open up a whole new approach to Second World War historiography, but it made him a very wealthy man, without a doubt. And that was part of the concern. The British government had a big concern about that if not just him, but there were a series of writers, as you mentioned, who were going off and cashing in on their past experiences, which is fine if they are not giving away any of the trade secrets in the process. Now, mind you, 40 years later, in the middle of the Cold War, the Russians aren't idiots. They know what is going on. And the fact that, yes, they knew either through John Cairncross, but also there was the number 30 military mission, the British military mission, which was in Russia, which was providing the Russians with Ultra in disguised form. but they were giving it to them. And it looks like the Russians certainly knew. And I think the code word that they used for it, the code name was, oh God, it escapes my memory, arsenic. Arsenic is what they called it, the arsenic series. Not sure how much of that has actually been revealed and released yet, but there is a bit more cooperation going on between the Western Allies and the Soviets when it comes to that than perhaps we've been led to believe. But that's Frederick Winterbottom. Now, the reason I wanted to mention that was not just because of his book, but because of what he was responsible for. He genuinely was extremely important in the ultra network, if you will. He was the one responsible for security. He was the one responsible for creating what are called the SLU and SCU network that handled the transmission of the ultra messages to the commanders. And perhaps more importantly, he was the one that was responsible for indoctrinating commanders and their staffs into the do's and don'ts of ultra. And that is really quite something, because he would sit down with Montgomery and with Eisenhower and with Patton and basically read them the Riot Act very politely. In other words, you are signing this, it's Official Secrets Act, and you know what happens if you violate the Official Secrets Act. And there's various ways of keeping you in line. Part of it was reputation. As a matter of fact, there is one school of thought out there that Patton's relief did not come because of his slapping incidents in Sicily, but rather because of his careless use of ultra. And as a result, they ended up using the slapping incidents as cover to get him out and to basically send a message to everybody else. In other words, if you don't play by the rules and you risk this source, you are going to be dealt with. Now, again, that is a theory. I've seen some information to that suggests this could be it, but I've never seen anything definitive on it. But again, what I think we can take away from tonight's talk is if there are people out there that are interested in moving in different directions for research, there's plenty of stuff in here tonight that's going to, that's going to spark your imagination for research. And that's really what we're up to. So you want to hit the next one?
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, and this is, we're getting into kind of how ultra works now. And I think this is key to do, because we have touched on it with David and Matt and Andy, but I think the fascination with the movies has been in the actual code breaking aspect. As you say, the application of it and how to inform the commanders how to act on it and what they can do and what they can't do. It is kind of overlooked in that fascination with the computers and the guys with pencils and papers with the waistcoats and the tweed and the leather patches on their elbows, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely wonderful to look into what Turing and Twin and Knox and Bill Tutt and all these other geniuses were doing at Bletchley Park. But at the end of the day, if you can't put this into action, it is a useless endeavor. It's academic at best. And the British certainly realized this. And Bletchley Park, and we talked about it, or at least the guests have talked about it, David Kenyon, the idea of Bletchley being a factory. And it certainly is. And the problem is, and this comes from some of the Bletchley histories as well that have been declassified in the last little while, is the way that the people who worked at Bletchley, because they were so, if you will, almost single-minded when it came to breaking codes and ciphers, it took a little while for them to develop their marketing research and their sales pitch. In other words, they were so fascinated on creating the product, they weren't really considering at first how they're going to distribute it, how they're going to get it to market, and more importantly, how they're going to get their customers, i.e. the commanders and their staffs, to accept it and trust it. And that was the key. Part of it was to take the commanders and the staff into pretty much what I'm doing right now, an elementary understanding, just enough so they would understand the process, but not all the technical jargon, if you will. In other words, they had to know that what they're getting was as good as gold. And they had to understand if it was not shiny and bright gold, like coming right from the horse's mouth, that there were other shades of gold, if you will, that were also pretty good and could be trusted. So basically what they did, the three top levels high are cryptography. So basically you've got the high level cryptography coming from Enigma, coming from Geheimschreiber, coming from Lorenz. Then you have medium and low level, more like the battlefield codes, the 5-letter codes that you would get further down the line. Then you have direction finding, which is all about establishing locations of transmitters. So then you could build an order of battle, knowing exactly, there's a radio here, there's a radio here, there's a radio here. Then you build, of course, the traffic analysis net, or through traffic analysis, you figure out the net, how many, messages are going back, who's the important one, who's firing up at one particular time when something happens. The other thing too is radio fingerprinting. That is figuring out the actual fingerprint, the signature of a particular set. And once you know that and you identify what it is, then you know from that radio fingerprinting who is speaking to whom or who is sending a message, even though you can't read the message. You suddenly know that, for instance, Kriegsmarine headquarters at Brest is suddenly firing up. You don't know what they're saying, but you know it's coming from them because you can ID the radio through the fingerprint. And then the flip side is something that was kind of made famous in the 70s with men called Intrepid, which was the idea of identifying an operator by their Morse signature. And apparently, and I have not done this myself, that apparently it is as good or almost as good as the human signature. In other words, your technique on when sending Morse code. So that's basically
just to add in there, my granddad was a Morse operator in World War II, just regular traffic between anti-aircraft batteries.
Yep.
And because he trained up others, could tell if he was listening whether someone was if someone went out for a crafty cigarette and someone else was operating the rest, he could tell whether it was the right person or the wrong person on the key because of the way they sounded. So that's at a very low level without coding and stuff, and he could tell who was on duty. So
that was extremely important in the operations of agents, because the idea was that, of course, they would all have sets and they'd be sending messages back on a semi-regular basis. And then, of course, if suddenly the signature changed a little bit, you knew that they were either under control or they were gone out of the seat. They were completely out of the picture and somebody else was in their seat. And part of the way, if you were an agent, of sending back a message to say that you had been compromised was to simply change up your pattern a little bit.
Yeah.
Just enough, just enough to lay that. So if we can move on, those are the tools of the trade. And again, this is the pecking order. So basically, ultra, when it comes to the cryptography, is at the top. The medium level and the low level actually had their own subcode names. A lot of people don't realize that. One was called Cyro-Pearl and the other one was Pearl for the medium and the low level cryptography. And then you had direction finding, which was known as Thumb. Okay, then you had traffic analysis. You had TINA, which was also a form of traffic analysis and radio fingerprinting. That actually had to do with the signatures. And then you had the radio fingerprinting of the wireless set itself. Okay, so that's the way it looks. It's more of a pyramid, and that's the way the commanders were told. This is what. And the other thing they were told is, of course, what we were covering. Now, I know the guests, I think both David Alexander and David Canning did wonderful jobs at showing, everybody around the, essentially what the coverage was like around the world. It was Japanese systems and Italian systems and apparently even Russian systems. Apparently we don't talk about that. And a whole bunch of others, French systems, Vichy French systems. But I've decided in this particular case, just to give you an idea of what the traffic coverage was like on German communications. So basically, you have everything from the air. Okay, you're covering what's going on with the Luftwaffe, what's going on with the army on the ground, the Navy out at sea, the SS and the police, the Abwehr, the Secret Service, plus transport and diplomatic. And there's probably one or two that I've forgotten, but the idea is to show you just the kind of scope that Bletchley Park has when it comes into tapping into the day-to-day operations of the Third Reich at war. It's absolutely incredible what they are doing. So that's the scope of it. The other thing, of course, is the process. All right. And I think it was one of the earlier guests had mentioned this all starts with interception. And without a doubt, there is a Y service in place. And it's, Y stations, lonely Y stations in the middle of nowhere where people are working 24 hours a day and they're intercepting signals. And when they intercept the signals that are coming in, German messages are being sent all over all over the place. They're intercepting them. They have no clue what they say because they're all coming in an enciphered format. So, but that's where it starts. And so it starts with these people doing the footwork. They are the boots on the ground, if you will. Okay. And they are intercepting. They are then sending those transmissions back to Bletchley Park, where the actual code breaking and the intelligence analysis happens. So basically, all of the raw messages are then sent in. And when it comes to air and military traffic, it goes to eventually to HUT 3. It goes to HUT 6 for breaking. Once it's broken, it goes to HUT 3, where the analysis is done. For the Navy, it was HUT 4 and HUT 8, or HUT 8 and HUT 4. And then to the Operational Intelligence Center. Basically,
and as we found out with David,
different.
halfway through the war, HUT 3 became an entire series of blocks. They just carried on using the name HUT 3.
Exactly.
Tradition, I guess.
Well, tradition, yeah, tradition and a culture. I mean, they had really developed an incredible pride in what they did. I was very fortunate about 25 years ago when I started my graduate work to correspond with several of the men who worked in HUT 3. I corresponded with Rafe Bennett, who wrote Ultra in the West, John Prestwich, who I have an undying affection for. He was an Oxford, I believe he was Oxford Don historian, one of the greatest medieval historians. His son as well, Michael, is a wonderful medieval historian. And, you know, here I am, this young, snot-nosed, graduate student. And he really was kind, absolutely kind, because I was uncovering some of this new stuff and I needed to talk to somebody. Somebody put me on to him, and he was as professorial as you could be. He was a wonderful teacher. And so I was able to correspond with him. I was also able to correspond with Harry Hinsley and Brigadier Williams, Peter Calvacarisi, all these guys who were involved with either HUT 3, Naval Section, or in the field, which was really amazing. So I had this incredible insight insight into their experiences. And part of it was this incredible pride in what HUT 3 did. I mean, the pressure that they were under. You know, when the war started, they were getting very few messages. By the end of the war, they're looking at maybe 4,000 to 5,000 messages a day coming through there. They're working 3 shifts, 8-hour shifts, 6 days a week, if I'm not mistaken, if not 7 at times in emergencies. And it's just heavy pressure all the time, because as soon as the messages come in, all right, they go to basically HUT 6. HUT 6 does the breaking. Once the breaking of the message is done, it's then it's revealed in its original German. And then, believe it or not, there is a conveyor belt that basically they just put the messages on the conveyor belt and it's sent to HUT 3. And that's where the fun begins, because that's where each message has to be sorted and logged. So in other words, where is it coming from? Is it air? Is it military? Fantastic. What unit is it coming from? All of that then is sorted and logged. And of course, as was mentioned earlier, I think it was David Kenyon mentioned the fact that they had catalogs. They basically had index cards, and they created this incredible catalog. So basically, you're building a library as you go. Well, from there, it goes to the watch for translation. So in other words, going from the German into the English, and emendation, which is basically cleanup, make sure that the message is pure, make sure there's no anomalies with it. And remember that translation is not easy. Translation is extremely important. And I'm sure as a Brit living in France, you probably understand that a little bit.
There's translation, there's interpretation, there's what are you
nuance.
Trying to say?
There's
one
nuance.
of the things Mag gets is just translate it into English, and a simple thing like a menu description can take ages, because what are you actually trying to say here? It's surprisingly difficult. Yeah.
Well, it's like deja vu, right? I mean, it's like we use that term because forget about trying to, translate it directly. Well, it can be very dangerous if you're dealing in military circles and you do not have the right translation. I mean, we talk about code breaking being tough, without a doubt, but just the general translation and understanding what your opponent means. Now, there's another layer to that, which we tend to forget: military speak. Because English and German may be English and German, but if anybody's ever spent time in the Army, you or the Air Force or the Navy, we have a language all of our own, right?
Yeah, and different between the services as well. It's not even the same within, and it's, so Yeah,
exactly.
Navy speak is different to Army speak, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the reasons why in HUT 3 you had air advisors, military advisors, naval advisors. I believe there was even a diplomatic advisor, because there were so many things that were coming in that required that expertise, that nuance, that understanding of nuance. So when that was done, and then basically it was translated, it was sent to the military and the air advisors, because they now needed to take these puzzle pieces and figure out where they fit in the overall scheme of things. Now, they were lucky because by this time, Winterbottom had set up the SCU and SLU connection between the forward commands. So what few historians have really tapped into, and this is key if you're going to do anything on Normandy, on Montgomery, on Eisenhower, on Dempsey, and whoever, or Patton, is that the messages were not just one way. A lot of people think that the messages were just going from Bletchley to the commands and nobody ever spoke back to Bletchley. This is not the case at all. As a matter of fact, the commanders in the field, through usually their intelligence officers, were in daily contact, if not hourly or live contact, with the advisors back in HUT 3. So literally, you have got the finger on the pulse. You are at the heartbeat of this. And from a historiographical perspective, if you want to, for instance, in theory, get down to the heart of the matter between, Montgomery versus Eisenhower and the strategic contretemps that is happening. What are we supposed to do in Normandy? Well, try tapping in, if you can get your hands on them, try to find the messages that are coming from Montgomery's headquarters back to HUT 3 or Eisenhower's headquarters back to HUT 3, because that is revealing what they are looking for.
I was just going to say, so the traffic going to Bletchley, is it questions or is it requests or is it both? I mean, if a commander is, so he's saying, we are particularly thinking about doing this here. Have you got anything about this particular German unit or anything about that? So, I think you're right.
Well, for security purposes,
a two-way street is kind of overlooked a little bit.
Yeah, I think, for security purposes, they're not going to say, on the 18th of July, we're going to be launching Operation Goodwood, but they're going to say, give me what you got south of Caen.
Yeah,
there is something happening in this sector. Give me focus on this. Because remember, one of the big things that they had to do, the advisors, is they had to understand what was on the mind of the commanders, because they had to know what messages had what priority.
I was just going to make that point. It's helping. I'm going to use the word triage, which I know doesn't apply to this exactly, but it kind of does. If they're getting towards the end of the war 5,000 messages a day, presumably 4,000 of them are going to help the war effort, not a little one iota. So this conveyor belt has to speed up the important ones through the system faster, and the less important ones to either be rejected or dismissed or going slower, because as we had with David Alexander the first day, there's no point finding out information after the use you can get from it has passed. If the German unit has already attacked or the ship has left the harbor, it's too late. So if the commanders are putting requests, by my understanding, it's then helping the people in HUT 3 speed the right processes to get the right information back. So it makes sense. It has to be a two-way street. Otherwise,
it's a symbiotic relationship, without a doubt. And that's something that has been missed in the historiography. And that's the thing that I think historians really have to focus on when you're looking at decision-making in the Second World War. You certainly have to do that. Once the messages are drawn up, then, of course, they're addressed. They're sent to the SLUs in the field, the SLUs via the SCU network. So SCU is Special Communications Unit. They don't know what's in the message. They just encipher and decipher. The SLUs do know what's in the message. They take it into either the commander, if it's real hot stuff, or they take it to the intelligence officer and they say, okay, here you go. And they also keep a watchful eye on how it's being employed. Because remember, the guiding rule is that you're not allowed to use any of these messages if it is going to risk the source.
Yeah.
Somehow, whether through reconnaissance, ground action, patrols, you need a plausible excuse for where you're getting this information from. And that is a tricky game, because a lot of times, for instance, just before Mortain, and this also affects Operation Totalize, the Canadian Army is told via Ultra that the 1st SS are pulling out and they're heading over they're heading back and then perhaps heading over. And they've got no way to corroborate this with the, of what's coming in. So they actually have to put on a small attack on August 5th just to go out and test the lines, not so much to corroborate, but to give an excuse to the Germans for how they figured out they were no longer there. So it's a very difficult game to play with this system. So the SCUs handle the messages. The SLUs are the ones who are, they crack the whip, and they keep an eye out for any commander or his staff that may be violating the rules. So it's a very tricky game that plays. And that's fascinating. I mean, that shows you the ultimate importance of this kind of information source. The fact that it would have its own communication network, not to mention come with its own security. And these guys under Winterbottom, working under Winterbottom, had the right to turn around and basically report back any kind of violation that could lead then to sanction and perhaps even sacking. As far as we know, with perhaps the exception of Patton in Sicily, it doesn't appear that anybody ended up being sacked for that. I'm sure there were a few knuckles that were rapped now and then, and I've seen some of the messages saying, "Hey, we've seen a wing commander being interviewed on the BBC following the Mortain counterattack, saying, 'Oh, we knew it was coming.'" Whoa, you know what I mean? This is where they had to jump in, and they were sending rockets to each other, saying, "Hey, where is this coming from, and why is this guy saying this? We cannot let this out." So to basically be indoctrinated, okay, meant you understood, you were told about it. You weren't necessarily told about Bletchley, but you were told that you could trust this information beyond anything. And that was the key. And then you joined an extremely exclusive club, and your name was put on what you see in front of you, the Ultra Recipients List. And this was the Bible used by the SLUs to make sure that you were okay, that you were in the Ultra Club, that you were entitled to not only see the material, but you were entitled to talk about it amongst other people who were indoctrinated. And then, of course, if you ever left your position where you didn't need to, then you would be taken off the list immediately. Generally speaking, it was for Army and Army group commanders and their staffs. It was very rare when a corps commander, and certainly none of their staffs that I know about, were ever indoctrinated. They usually kept it to the Army and Army group level. There were a few exceptions. One of them was Freiburg on Crete. He was a corps commander, but he needed it. So they made special provisions. And another one, which is a very strange case, and it was considered to be very unusual, was Guy Simmons, the 2nd Canadian Corps commander. And part of that had to do with, and a lot of people don't know this, but Harry Creer, the 1st Canadian Army commander, was chronically ill. And he was worried before Normandy happened that he may not be able to fulfill his duties. So therefore, he basically tapped Simmons on the shoulder as his heir apparent, and that he would take over temporarily or permanently should Creer go down. And as such, Winterbottom was brought in to indoctrinate Simmons for this. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. In the fall of 1944, Simmons ended up taking over as Army commander, but he had been getting the information at 2nd British Army headquarters under Dempsey, who he was working at. And that posed a bit of a difficulty and a bit of a problem because his staff wasn't getting it. So his chief of staff, Elliot Rodger, told me, he said it was quite obvious later on because there were some things that, they would do their work. They would do a fantastic bit of work. All the lower level intelligence was done at Corps. And then suddenly the master would come in, as he would call them, and have a completely different picture in his mind. And he was like, wait a second, where did you get this from? And sure enough, it would happen. And so at first, until the Ultra Secret was revealed, Elliot Rodgers for a while was sitting there going, maybe this guy really has a sixth sense. You know what I mean? So it was fascinating that even his own staff didn't know. Now, what you're seeing in front of you are the address groups. So I'm going to show you some examples of the messages that were sent to the front. And you can see, just for instance, in Normandy and Northwest Europe in 44, 45, you have everybody in the loop. You have Cossack for the planning. You have SHAEF, Eisenhower's headquarters. You have the United States Tactical Air Force, Air Defenses of Great Britain, 1st U.S. Army Group, which then merges later on with 12th Army Group. You have the 8th Air Force Bomber Command. I know there were some questions before whether Bomber Command and 8th Air Force got Ultra. Yes, they did, without a doubt. You have the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. And then, of course, on the ground, you have Montgomery's 21st Army Group plus the Tactical Air Force. You all later on, they end up combining into one headquarters because they're using the same, intelligence all the time. And then you have the armies, the 2nd British Army, the Canadian Army. Now, the interesting part with those is those address groups serve 2 headquarters, serve the Army and the supporting Tactical Air Force Group. So that's fascinating to see. And then, of course, you have 3rd U.S. Army, 1st U.S. Army, etc. And the same thing, there would be addresses for those that were fighting in North Africa, those that were fighting in Italy, those that were fighting in the Pacific. And sometimes you will see some messages that are sent globally, and you'll see it filled with these addresses at the top.
We got a question here that I fear could end up disappearing into an hour sidebar, but were there cases of senior Allied commanders misunderstanding, not appreciating, or not reacting appropriately? And I mean, I guess we could go through individual cases or individual commanders, and that could take us all evening. But generally speaking, in your study of this, are there certain, when we look at that slide there, are there certain organizations that seem to have like a more trusting attitude to Ultra and some that are more dismissive? Are there trends that you can follow? Because, we know with let's take platoon commanders and infantry. Some might like patrols, some might prefer aerial photos, some might prefer. There's various kind of ways people would lead, I suppose. So in looking at that, are there kind of
this opens it up. Okay. First of all, no intelligence source is ever 100% complete.
Of course.
Okay. So that was key, is understanding that. But the other thing with Ultra, because Ultra was probably the only time in history that we know of that we have seen anything that was as shiny gold as this coming in, it was never dismissed out of hand. And part of the reason was because the boss was always looking over your shoulder. And I don't mean Stalin, I mean Churchill, because Churchill was getting this as well. So there was always a potential that you would need to answer for something. But also, too, remember that because it was so secretive, because it was so good at what it did, it also became kind of trendy. In other words, you wanted to be ultra indoctrinated, and you were wondering why 3 or 4 of the staff were going off and having meetings with this strangely clad British officer, and you were not there. And so things were never dismissed. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean that you drew the right conclusions from what Ultra was telling you. It doesn't mean that what Ultra revealed in one message couldn't be changed and missed in the next. There were potentials for this. But we're talking about probabilities here. And having something like Ultra takes the probabilities up into the 90th percentile compared to everything else. And that
in using a ridiculous analogy, it's Saturday afternoon tomorrow. I'll be watching Ipswich play. If the Ipswich team could find out the other team's team sheet a bit earlier than it was released, but knowing the team sheet doesn't necessarily tell you how to play the game, does it? It's only part of the story, isn't it? It's not going to win the game for you. It's just giving you another level of information you can use with everything else. Where luck,
but that's a bit of a different game. The game that I would say it resembles more would be baseball, in the sense that baseball relies on signals. Signals between the pitcher and the catcher, right? To put action into play, the signal between the manager and the catcher, the signal between the base coaches and whatever else. And you're absolutely right. Just because you know a guy is going to steal second base doesn't mean your catcher is going to be able to throw him out all the time. Right? But you want to have that chance. You want to know he's going. And you want to know if they're going to pull off a suicide squeeze at home, you can pitch out. You see? So I think that's probably a better analogy in that sense. But yes, to get back to the question, there were times when they did either miss things completely, they didn't necessarily assess it properly. One of them, I would argue, is Mortain in the Ardennes. They had plenty of ultra information, as you will see in a couple of seconds, that absolutely revealed what was happening. But basically what they did is they could not believe that the Germans would be that freaking stupid. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
This is not a sound operation of war.
There's too good to be true aspect, in a sense.
Exactly.
They can't be doing that. That would be just stupid. That would be,
Well,
so
that was the big lesson out of Mortain that was learned by the 1st Canadian Army, by Peter Wright, who was the intelligence officer at 1st Canadian Army. He said the first job of an intelligence officer is to assess what the enemy is doing. Later on is to figure out whether he should be doing it. And the problem is, a lot of times, not only in this, but also in history, we tend to superimpose what we believe should be happening as opposed to the reality based on the evidence. Right? And you and I have talked about that earlier in the context of Dieppe and research like that. Well, to get back to the messages, you see one of the messages in front of you.
Here's a triage system explained, isn't it? Essentially.
Yeah, and
I might continue my analogy.
Yeah, there you go. And it's not ripped up. That's just the PowerPoint doing that, okay? But basically what you see is at the top, you will see the message priority. And the message priority is one of 5 Zs or Zs, okay, depending on where you are in this world. And basically 1 is low priority, no urgency. 2nd is non-urgent tactical information. The triple Z, between 2 and 3 Zs would be your normal. That's your average or your mean. 4 Zs and 5 Zs means, oh boy, something's happening. You better pay attention to this and take action on it now. And if you flip the slide to the next one, here are the turnaround times. Basically, the average everyday Z would take 8 hours, but by the time you get to the 4 and 5 Zs, they're turning this around in just under 2 hours, which is amazing. By the time they decrypt it, by the time it's sent, it's almost in real time.
So that's an hour from arriving at Hut 3 or from...
After the decryption. No, before deciphering. Yeah, well, no, sorry. That's from the message being sent. So basically, by the time it's sent from Bletchley, if it's top priority, within an hour and 6 minutes, it's in the commander's hand being assessed.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it's for 1944, it's real time. It's
effectively it's real time, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, when we're talking in 1944, aerial photos from aircraft had to be taken down, developed, printed, distributed by dispatch riders. That's going to this is about as fast as anything could possibly be, isn't it?
Yeah, and also too the nature of this. I mean, the messages are coming from the horse's mouth. They are, reporting what is coming directly from the messages. Now, sometimes there will be comments, and they'll actually mention that. Okay, so comment, and the Hut 3 advisor will mention something that will, spin it one way or another. So the 3 messages, I've just taken 3 messages from the Mortain counterattack. There's got 50 or 60 really important ones. And to be honest with you, we should do a show on Mortain.
We do a whole show on that. Yeah, I was just thinking
that. Easily do that. But just to give you an example. So at the top, you have the CX, most secret source, and that's just the logging. The next one is the XL. And if you're going to go through these files, you want to take a look at the XL number because that's the chronological cataloging. Okay. And then actually, if you can blow that up, I think if you just go to the next slide, No, you don't have to zoom up. Just go to the next slide. I blew it up. There we go. Yeah, so there we go. So XL 4795, and then you see the priority. So top priority, right? I mean, this is stop the presses, boom, something's going to happen. And then you can see here the addresses. So it goes to Eisenhower at SHAFE, SH. SHA is his tactical headquarters, so his advanced headquarters. Army Group, I think it's 1st U.S. Army Army Group is BV. It goes to ONCR, YKZ, ZE, and EF. So all the armies in the field, etc. So everybody is being lit up about this. Okay, this is quite something. So basically, and the way they would do this is they wrote it out. All right, so all numbers were written out. They wanted to eliminate as much friction and the possibility of mistake. Okay, so basically pulling out of division and strong indications, in other words, that because of the message, they weren't necessarily sure, but they're 90% sure, began during the night, according to Flyvo, from 1 Sugar Division, 1st SS Division, and it came in at 0530 hours on the 5th. So at 5:30 in the morning on the 5th, the pulling out of the 1st SS Division was starting to occur. According to the Flyvo is a shorthand term for the Luftwaffe liaison officer that is with the divisions. As a matter of fact, this is where the penetration of air codes, all right, Luftwaffe codes, helps the ground game, because these Luftwaffe liaison officers are attached to every single division. And so basically, Bletchley Park has been tapping into what they're saying. And of course, as you know, when it comes to the German doctrine, the Luftwaffe is all about ground support. So finding out what the Luftwaffe are up to or are planning is absolutely gold for finding out what's going on the ground, because they are sending out their liaison messages all the time. So in this case, the 1st SS is pulling out. And of course, the only reason why the 1st SS pulling out would be rated as 5Zs or 5Zs is because obviously Bletchley Park has been in touch with the commanders in the field, 21st Army Group, and somehow they understand the vital significance of this potential action right here. So they know that this SS division, which is pulling out from in front of the Canadians on the Falaise Road, is a significant development. And then, of course, later on, to give you an example, this comes up a little bit later. I'm not sure if it's the same day. I think it is. This is the orders for the 2nd JAD Corps. So basically the Luftwaffe to go into action. And you can see that this is the first mention of where they're going to launch their counterattack. Branche, exactly. So that's their Schwerpunkt right there, their center of gravity and their axis of advance. I mean, this literally is the Germans sticking their head into the noose, if the Allies pick up on that fact. Now, the problem was, depending on which headquarters you were at, the interpretations were a bit different. So, for instance, Montgomery thought maybe it was a reorganizing of a line. Bradley didn't think they would do something that stupid. And, you know, Patton, I think for the most part, kind of felt the same way. I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at this specifically, but they were varying degrees of interpretation of what it all meant. But what they didn't really assume was this was truly going to be the first of 2 suicidal counterattacks. But at the same time, they were smart enough not to throw caution to the wind, because this was such a good source that they could say, well, wait a second, even though we don't think it's really going to happen, let's just make sure we're in solid around Mortain just in case. And so that's how this thing goes into action. And you can show the next one.
Yeah, there we are.
Next message. Is that the same one?
No, that's number 3. Yeah, no,
that's the 3 one. Okay, that's the 3rd one. And you can see here. Yeah. So no, that's the 2nd one.
Hang on. 1.
That's the 1st one.
3. There we go.
3. There we go. Okay. So basically, 5 Panzer divisions now. Now they are seeing that this is taking shape. This is taking form. They know who's involved with this. And you can see that everybody is getting this message up at the top, right? Except there is one address missing for whatever reason. And this is a completely different show that you and I will have to do. The Canadian Army is not on this list for some reason.
Okay.
And that then has a completely different effect, because routing is so important. When you are a decision maker, like Creer, like Simmons, or Patton, or Montgomery, or Dempsey, you are hooked on this. And suddenly, and this is the key, Ultra could not be overturned by any other source of information other than Ultra. All right? Because it was really up at the top of the pecking order. So even though your ground troops may be saying something, your aerial reconnaissance may be saying something, your lower level SIGINT may be saying something, the power of Ultra like this was the defining hand. Okay, and that's coming from Montgomery's intelligence czar, Bill Williams, who was considered to be the godfather of ultra in the field. He was the one who taught everybody how to interpret it, essentially, how to blend it in with the other sources, etc. But at the same time, it's very much ultra. Ultra is the drummer in the band. Okay, everybody keys off him. And so as a result, this message then, had it gone to 1st Canadian Army, that is a very interesting counterfactual about how the 1st Canadian Army would have approached Operation Totalize on the 8th.
Yeah, because I was going to say, because they're not directly involved in Mortain at all, but where they are is where the German units are pulling out of, so it influences what they could be doing in Caen, which means if they move, let's say they move southwards 3 or 4 days earlier, that potentially could end up changing the Falaise pocket, because everybody gets where they're supposed to be earlier. And I mean, yeah, you're right. I think we should do a whole show on this. And and Tim Sampson just said there, that it's applying your mindset to the enemy, because by this point, early August, this is literally 2 months in, the Germans have been pretty much following a hold, full back, counterattack a little bit, hold, pull back, counterattack a little bit mentality. And this is completely a curveball out of nowhere. When I do tours to Mortain, I've done 20 or so over the years, I just always explain just how fundamentally stupid the German plan is. What are they supposed to do when they get to Avranches? How are they going to reinforce it? What's the ultimate aim behind it? It failed every basic principle of military sense. And so...
And you're right. And this opens up a whole new conversation, because basically what you're doing is Hitler is not thinking like a military man. Yeah. He's thinking like a politician. He realizes that if he loses Normandy, he doesn't really have a chance. So he has to roll the iron dice and go all in politically. And that means, using whatever he has in the field. To the men on the ground, von Klug and the others, they're like, this is crazy. And of course, they're sensing that this is crazy, but we're going to do it anyway. And so you can understand how the Allied intelligence officers and commanders do misinterpret it, because it is so out of left field. But that, again, is the great lesson in all of this and in intelligence work, is trust your evidence, even if it is telling you something different.
That's a really good point, isn't it? Yeah. Just because you wouldn't do something doesn't mean the enemy won't do something. There might be a reason for it. And as you say, the evidence is literally staring you in the face, and folks, we're just to remind, this is all happening. These messages are 2 days before the German offensive began. So there is clearly enough time to really, really move units around, change the order of battle, move around your chess pieces. And they did a little bit, as you said, but not enough. I mean, okay, we know that within 4 days the Operation Lutich has failed, and weather didn't help, but we could have helped it fail more decisively, more quickly, and more thoroughly.
Without a doubt. Well, for instance, just quickly, we'll jump ahead, and we got to do another show on this one. But had the Canadian Army been given the full access, they would have known that the Falaise Road literally was wide open all the way to Falaise. Now, that sets up a counterfactual argument, and I've had arguments with John Rickard, who was on before, and we're polar opposites on this one. But the fact is that if the road was open, then that changes the whole mentality of Simmons, who is planning Operation Totalize, and hey, maybe the Falaise Gap happens 2 weeks earlier. And
somewhere else, effectively, as well.
Exactly. Possibly. Yeah. It happens around Falaise as opposed to
as it happens where it's labeled, as opposed to where it ended.
Exactly. Up. Yeah.
I'm literally just writing a chapter for a book. I've been commissioned to do a photographic book, and they've chosen the photos, and I'm adding the story. And they've chosen 3 photos of Falaise, and I said, well, actually, you need a photo of Montreal, because Falaise pocket actually isn't in Falaise.
It's all about the mace. Yeah.
It's one of those weird misnomers. But we'll move on to you mentioned Williams a minute ago. So
this is Bill Williams. Now, Bill Williams was fascinating. He was an armored commander, if I'm not mistaken, when the war began, or a troop commander. And turned out he had weak eyes, believe it or not, and the desert sun didn't do him any favors. So because he could not command in battle anymore after being wounded, he wanted to stay in the army. And the fact that he was a young Oxford Don, a budding historian at this point, he was perfect for assembling the kind of evidence, right? I mean, one of the reasons why historians in some cases do go into intelligence work is because, frankly, that it's the same discipline. In other words, you're taking information, you're weighing it, you're trying to figure out the veracity of it, where it all fits, you're putting the big picture together. So as a result, he was fantastic at this. And very quickly, he won over Montgomery, which says a lot. Montgomery, I don't think, was complimentary about anyone ever, except for Bill Williams. And
he's in a very small list, isn't he? Let's be honest.
Very small list, yeah. And I think
about the same length as the list of people MacArthur is nice about.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, very, very tiny. But the thing is, part of it was that Bill Williams was not a career military man. He was a historian who couldn't give a damn. And although he was very polite about it, he just basically went in and said, yeah, and he started off as his G1I and then ended up as his BGSI, so Brigadier General Staff Intelligence. And basically he said, look, here's my job. This is what I do. I'm very good at it. And here's what it's telling me. You're the military mind. I'll tell you what the information is revealing about Rommel in the desert, and you make sense out of it. And sure enough, they worked like this. They were absolutely fantastic. But the interesting part was he was the first intelligence officer to get Ultra on a regular basis and in volume. So he quickly mastered how to use it and then ended up teaching all of the other intelligence staffs, whether it was, in the Canadian Army, the British Army, or even with the Americans. The Americans loved Bill Williams. He was so respected, not only for his talent, but apparently, from what I understand, he was one hell of a nice gentleman as well. And so, but he was extremely brilliant. And he was also self-effacing. I've read a lot of his reports. I had some correspondence with him. And he was very good at placing himself and the work that he did in context. And that's what I always appreciated about him. And one thing I learned about him that makes a good historian and a good intelligence officer is the ability to be intellectually honest, regardless of how painful that honesty is. And that was the thing with him. Now, of course, it didn't mean that he was 100% correct all the time or could see everything. But again, when we're talking about probabilities, here is a guy who was better than probably most at doing what he was doing. But his relationship with Montgomery was important because he said Montgomery's attitude, his I alone attitude and his ego was the perfect cover for anything to do with Ultra. Because, Montgomery could claim it was his, quote, sixth sense, and people would buy it. That, oh, no, I knew they were going to attack at Alam Halfa. That's just part of my glandular makeup. I'm Montgomery, And so they were able to sell the fact that, of course, they had been breaking the messages that were heading to Rommel, and they knew exactly that Rommel was going to attack when and where at Alam Halfa, and they were able to turn that into a great victory at El Alamein. And then it just continued to snowball from there. All the way through Tunisia, into Sicily and Italy briefly, and then, of course, into Normandy right to the end of the war. So I think the Allied world owes this man a huge debt of gratitude, and probably somebody that a lot of people have no clue about.
We've just been admitting that in the sidebar there that we don't know this name. I'm trying to work out what that cat badge is as well.
Oh, that was his first unit. It is, oh God, you guys you hit him up on Wikipedia.
I thought it was Scots Guards, but it's not Scots Greys, but it's not Scots Greys.
No, it's not. It's another one. It is, but it's his unit, and he always wore that. In other words, he never switched his cap badge over to intelligence. He kept his loyalty to his unit, to his original unit.
Someone will know. Julian Whippy's watching. He might know. Someone will know. I'm trying to recognize. I'm trying to place it, but I can't. But anyway,
I had looked it up earlier. It came up as a sidebar. So if you hit him up on the net or Wikipedia or as obituary, you'll be able to see it and figure it out. It just escapes me at the moment. Okay. The other thing too is, remember, as I mentioned before, you've got, the boss watching over your shoulder. And to give you an example, if you blow this one up, Woody, this is the Prime Minister's message. Okay. He is sending this to Montgomery. And basically you could see it at the top, or excuse me, to General Alexander. So basically, he refers to Ultra as Boniface. Boniface shows the enemy in great anxiety and disarray at Berat, and under lively fear of being cut off there by an enveloping movement from the south, which he expected might come or might become effective as early as December 26th. So basically, what he's doing is he's putting pressure on his commanders because he's reading his own Ultra, and Churchill is working as his own intelligence officer, for better or for worse. And then, of course, he's sending off his action this day rockets to his commanders in the field. So there is another level and layer to Ultra when it comes to the historiography. In other words, if you want to understand Churchill and if you want to understand his relationships, with his generals in the field, you definitely have to tap into the messages that he was sending that were considered ultra secret and remain classified until only about 20 years ago. So it's very difficult when I read some of those pre-1995, pre-2000 assessments, and particularly when they rely on correspondence, knowing full well that the ultra correspondence have not been seen, let alone factored in. That is kind of difficult. But it's, Churchill used to get a box filled with pages every single day. It was like his addiction. It was his crack. Basically, he would sit there at night in his pajamas on his bed with his cigars and his brandy going, and he'd be like a child. As a matter of fact, Bill Williams tells a great story about just before Goodwood, or just after Goodwood, when Goodwood fails to, break out the way they expected. Churchill arrives, and everybody knows that Churchill is coming to sack Montgomery. That's the prevalent mindset on the 19th. And so everybody is waiting for him to lop off the head of the chief, kind of like when the general manager comes down into the dressing room to talk to the coach and the players, something's going on. Well, Bill Williams said that the only reason that Montgomery, in his opinion, his command was saved on the 19th or on the 20th, I guess late on the 20th, was because suddenly the Ultra arrived all about the assassination attempt on Hitler. And the way he describes it, and picture this, here's Churchill, Williams, and Montgomery sitting on the floor of Monty's caravan in Normandy, like kids on Christmas Day, opening up their box of Ultra and basically passing it around.
Look what I've got. Look what I've got.
Oh my God, Vinciblin's in it. This person's, it's a great story that he tells about that. It was absolutely amazing. And just the idea of how intoxicating Ultra has become, the culture, the development of the Ultra culture. And that's basically it. And you can start to see this. And the fact that, you have somebody like Churchill, who's its great patron. Everybody is paying attention to it, whether they like it or not.
Point there, David, that we're lucky that Churchill and these other people like Williams and are singing the praises of this early, because poor old Andy Boyd yesterday talking about FECB, that with all honesty, their work wasn't really being taken seriously in 41, 42. It kind of was and it wasn't. And it makes you wonder. I mean, I know it was the other side of the world, so there's all that communication difference. And this is the UK. Bletchley is 50 miles from London, wherever it is, So, but it makes you realize that Ultra has this prestige and sexiness, I suppose, that these other organizations around the world perhaps were wishing they had, because the information that these places are getting is equally good in many cases, but in this case there are these ambassadors for it that's driving this need for it to be accepted and considered a vital part of winning the war, I suppose.
Well, yeah, and certainly by 1944, it had been through, 2.5 years through the ringer. It was tried and true. There's no doubt about it. It was tried and true. So, and also too, when you think about the kind of receptive nature that it had with a character like Churchill, I mean, for better or for worse, we always talk about Churchill in one way or another. But to be honest with you, I given what I know about signals intelligence and the impact it makes on the course of the war as being such an incredible force enhancer and, an information weapon system, the world, again, owes an incredible debt to Churchill in this sense, because he was not anti-intellectual. He embraced things like this. And yes, he was a child at times when it came to intelligence. But in this particular case, we don't have an ultra network the way we do if it's not for him being receptive to it. And of course,
in this regard, Churchill, because Churchill loved anything new, didn't it? I mean, a lot of the gadgetry, commandos, airborne forces, LRDG, SAS. I mean, he gave pretty much anything that was new and shiny his backing, and some of those things were brilliant, and some of the things perhaps weren't quite brilliant. But in this case, the whole ultra thing is one of his one of the things he got behind that was just brilliant.
Well, remember, he had also had experience with it in the First World War.
True.
Remember, was it First Lord of the Admiralty? First Lord?
Yeah.
First Lord of the Admiralty. He had been involved with signals intelligence during the First World War. As a matter of fact, he was there when some of the pinch material arrived that the Russians had taken from the Germans. And he was, he understood code breaking. I mean, so this was more than just a recent or a passing fancy. This was something he knew and truly believed in. But again, flip side, I think there was a question earlier in this week about the Germans. Well, the Germans were damn good at code breaking as well. They were very good at direction finding and signals intelligence. But the massive difference was they didn't have a champion in the Third Reich to push it to this level that they had.
And neither did they have the factory, if we want to continue that.
They didn't have the factory.
They didn't have the infrastructure. They didn't have the ambassador, the champion. They didn't have the factory behind it. So, and it's come up several times this week. We're at the brink now of wanting to now know the German and Japanese response to all this. I mean, we know that the Germans didn't realize that we were cracking their codes, but did they ever get any points where they questioned it? Were there meetings where they went, maybe they know something? There's lots more that we don't know, and probably because of the loss of archives, we may never know.
Well, it's starting to come out now that certainly they did. But one of the problems was, a couple of problems. First of all, they believed in the impregnability of the Enigma to a degree. They basically said that, yes, in theory, it can be broken, but there's no way that the British or the enemy in this case would ever be smart enough to develop infrastructure to be able to do it on a sustained basis. So in other words, they never conceived that Bletchley Park could actually exist. That by the end of the war, there'd be 10,000 people working in the entire network that were pumping out this kind of intelligence. The kind that the world had never seen before. The Germans thought it was only theoretically possible. They didn't think that they would actually or could do it. And therefore, the flip side, the Germans didn't put a lot of effort into it either. In other words, they made their breaks, but it was like, yeah, thank you. This is lovely value added. As opposed to, again, it was kind of like occasionally you get a guest lead soloist to come in and play a lead solo as opposed to being the drummer in the band. That was the conceptual difference between the German approaches. And of course, they knew every once in a while that the Enigma had been penetrated, but they basically tried to solve that by either changing the key tables or just basically upgunning the machines themselves a little bit. But they never got to the point of completely replacing Enigma. And, Enigma is the machine, the Cypher machine that's used most widely. And so that was the big problem. They never thoroughly
replaced. Talked about with other experts this week, even if they had wanted to, halfway through the war, how would they have achieved it anyway? They've got machines around the world. It would have been impossible anyway, wouldn't it?
Think about the communications downtime. I mean, it was tough enough when the four-rotor came in. The four-rotor was being distributed for a year, all through 1941. It took a year before they could get it up to a sufficient level for U-boats in the Atlantic to start using it. So yeah, it's difficult. It's, you know, it's not as easy as just saying, oh, well, you know, the Germans are onto it, let's just change everything. Ideally, and I think it was David Alexander who pointed that out, ideally, they should be moving away from symmetrical into asymmetrical forms of encryption, because sometimes it's not just a mousetrap. It's, you want to move from a mousetrap and bring in a laser. You know what I mean? Completely change the game, right? Completely change it so you're no longer dealing with something that your opponent can actually get their head around. And, you know, if you change the concept, that is much more fundamental than just changing the technology.
Yeah.
You know, change your complete approach to something. That's incredible. So
well, let's move through the next few slides.
Yep,
So we've got
real quick, because we want to take some questions.
We've got some time to do some questions as well, because I mean, we're loving this and people are loving it, but let's rattle on a little bit. So this
if you blow this up real quick, this was one that was sent out for D-Day, and you can see this is a personal message that was sent by Bill Williams to Monk Dixon, who I believe was Bradley's chief intelligence officer. And so basically, they're talking about that the Germans are onto them, that they know where this is going to come. In other words, this is, if you look down, this is the 2nd of June, okay, at 1700. All right, 2nd of June to 3rd of June, 1944. And the Germans know, or have assessed essentially correctly, where this is going to happen. In other words, they don't know when, but they know where. So basically, where is it? It says actually Normandy at one point. It says Allied landing preparations are complete. Slightly layback infantry. Yeah, so basically they're saying that, you know, it may cause a slight delay to the layback infantry divisions from the Pas de Calais, but it's not going to slow down the panzers. The panzers are going to come down hell-bent for leather, and they're going to try to drive the Neptune landing forces back into the sea. So, I mean, this is something that they're finding out 4 days before. They know how tough they are, you know, the tough fight that they're in for. But the other thing is interesting is that they know that the Germans are taking hook, line, and sinker when it comes to Operation Fortitude. Because right here, they're saying that, yes, we don't think that Normandy is going to be the main thrust, that we believe the main thrust is going to come at Calais. But at the same time, we are going to drive the Allies back into the sea at Normandy. I mean, this is something that, you know, 4 days before, and you can imagine the stress on Eisenhower. You know, it was mentioned, you know, Eisenhower's failure letter. Now you can understand, you know, they know that the Germans have an understanding of what is going on, and they know the game plan they're going to employ.
Which just, I mean, every time we hit the anniversary of June the 6th, there's always those little 5 things you didn't know about D-Day, 10 things you didn't know about the Battle of Normandy that go round the kind of the media things. And one of the things is that the Germans had no idea it was a complete surprise. And you go, no.
No.
No, I mean, not completely. I mean, they didn't know it, but yeah, I don't know how that still manages to go on. This idea that Germans had no idea that D-Day was happening and where it was going to happen and when it was going to happen. I mean, yeah.
I deal with DIEP. You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Trust me. I know, but yeah, it's the same thing. And I mean, you have the evidence right in front of you. Now, you have to understand that I'm giving you selections today. Right? I mean, really, if you're going to sit down, you have to go through the whole corpus of material. You have to, cross-reference it with intelligence summaries, other sources that are coming in, the decisions, the messages, and everything else. But a lot of these, what you're seeing, are striking. And again, like I mentioned, points of entry for new historical research. In other words,
it seems to me if any of these campaigns, battles, Market Garden, whatever, there is the seeds for entire books on just documents within Ultra. Forget about the other research you were doing outside. There's ideas, concepts just in this documentation, and it's an exciting time to think that there are historians, maybe even watching this show right now, who in a couple of years' time are going to be going and pulling out these archives and doing,
fingers crossed,
at the time, groundbreaking work about Allied understanding of Market Garden or Battle of the
Yep.
Bulge or whatever it would be. It's really quite
Or something
amazing,
else that we haven't heard of. I mean, you take a look at this. Here's a great example. You guys probably know about the Bodenplatte raid, which was the New Year's Day raid, the last kick at the can that the German Air Force took. Well, when I was researching this a couple of years ago, this popped up, which is amazing because, as you can see, it was written on the same day after the attack came in. And it was written by the tactical air forces, a message that was sent when basically somebody questioned them as to why they were caught with their pants down. And basically what they're saying is, we weren't caught with our pants down. We knew the raid was coming, but all our fighters are busy on ground support fighting the Battle of the Bulge that we figured, oh, well, we don't need to defend our airfields. We can absorb those losses. We're not moving away from our center of gravity and the focus right now. So in other words, a lot of times we had heard that the Allies were completely caught off guard, that the Germans surprised them. No, not at all. They knew about it days beforehand, but made a calculated decision not to change course because it would deflect from what they thought was the priority, which was putting their fighters on ground support to the embattled forces that were hanging on against the Germans that were pushing through the Ardennes. It makes perfect sense, without a doubt. It is cold, it is cruel, it is shrewd, but that's what needs to be done. And they're just laying that out there. In other words, look, we've got thousands of bombers. It doesn't matter if we lose, 20, 30, 40, 50 on the ground. They can be replaced. But we can't give off. We can't give this away. We can't change our particular course of action right now. Yeah. So there you go. That's one. The other thing, too, which is really important, and my God, you got to reach out to Bob Hanyuk and get him on. Bob Hanyuk. But by the way, guys, if you ever want to read
I have asked him to be on a show. He's not really familiar, kind of on with the podcast kind of formula.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Well,
Bob wishes me well, and I may convince him later on. But right now, he's kind of not
I'll twist his arm. I'll twist his arm. Maybe I'll come on with him and hold his hand. But Bob's brilliant, and Bob did an incredible job, and you can find it online. It's called either Eavesdropping on Hell or I think it's Eavesdropping on Hell. And it was done when he was working at the NSA, and he was a NSA historian. And he looked at the evidence from Ultra concerning the Holocaust. And it was chilling, without a doubt. And it's incredible because it's literally coming from the horse's mouth. And the book is available online for free. You can find it in PDF form. And it's available either at you can Google it and you'll find it. It's only
I found it. I downloaded it. It's on my desktop. It's a harrowing and yet revelation kind of reading.
I would argue it's probably one of the most important books ever written on the Second World War, period. Simply because of the fact that it uses the primary sources from code breaking about this. And if you flip to the next one, I'll just give you an example of some of the messages. And if you take a look at the date up on the right, this is 12th of September, 1941. So just after Barbarossa begins. You're about 2.5 months into Barbarossa. And this is the assessment that Bletchley Park is making. The execution of Jews is so recurrent a feature of these reports that the figures have been omitted from the situation reports and brought under one heading. Whether all those executed as, quote, Jews are indeed such is, of course, doubtful, but the figures are no less conclusive as evidence of a policy of savage intimidation, if not ultimate extermination. September 1941. You know what happens with this? Churchill sees this and risks Ultra. He actually goes into Parliament and warns the world of what the Germans are doing to the Jews. A lot of people don't realize that. And this was highly risky, but he wanted to basically fire a shot across the bow to try to get them to stop. As a matter of fact, after that, the SS and the police started to tighten up their security a little bit on their ciphers because they figured this was the only way that they could come to this assessment. And that almost backfired. But throughout the war, Bletchley, again, turns in another brilliant performance, and they are able to continue to keep monitoring the SS, the transportation, and of course the police networks, and they are able to keep a finger on the pulse. So by the time you get to 1945 and that famous band of brothers where they suddenly arrive, no, they knew where these concentration camps were, not the frontline troops, of course, but certainly there was an intelligence workup of where all of these were. And basically the troops were being directed to them. In other words, just go down this forest road and see what you find. Knowing full well.
So against what we think, isn't it? It's so against the conventional narrative. And
yeah. And it's amazing to see. And of course, that was done for security. And a bit of a side note, the head American representative at Bletchley Park, a man by the name of Telford Taylor, ended up being one of the lead prosecutors at Nuremberg. Now, of course, you have to remember, he had access to all of this ultra, and he knew where to go, but he couldn't use the ultra as evidence. So in other words, he's sitting there with a mountain of it, but couldn't use it for security purposes, but he knew how to argue his point, right? And he was able to set up the argument knowing full well how to box his opponent in because of this. So in other words, it's like the police or, Secret Service using illegal wiretaps. In other words, they can't enter them as evidence, but they still have the information that they can use as power. And that's what Telford Taylor was doing at Nuremberg. Okay, so again, another point of entry for a PhD dissertation. And then, of course, some of these are amazing, and you get ready for these ones. The decision to drop the atomic bomb. Now, of course, at the end of the war, or as the war was nearing, the war in Europe has ended, and of course, all eyes now focus on Japan. And the idea was, how long are they going to hold out? In other words, are they going to surrender first? Are they going to run out of raw material and resources? Or are they going to sue for peace before, we're going to have to invade, or whether we can drop the bomb? So if you can quickly show these three, you'll notice how chilling this is when you put two and two together. So for instance, this is the political intentions. And basically you can see the little sideline passage that despite the fact that diplomats are considering surrender, the government is not, and the government will not do that until the Japanese public are absolutely behind the idea of surrender. So if you are sitting there as Truman and the American chiefs of staff at this time, you're looking at this saying, yeah, despite what the diplomats are saying, there's no reality in fact that this is going to happen until these conditions meet. And of course, it's then supported by the next two. And the next two messages are absolutely fascinating and show you the desperation of the Japanese. So basically, what they're doing is they're taking pine root and turning it into oil for aviation. So basically, they feel that they can provide or create about 236,000 tons of pine root oil in the fiscal year that can be used in engines of aircraft. Now, remember, by this time, we're not talking about aircraft on two-way missions. They're going out, they're not coming home. The kamikaze's in effect. So in other words, you don't give a damn about the wear and tear on your engine. You don't need high crude oil or gasoline or fuel. You just need something that is going to make the puppy fire up, and you can get it up in the air to reach its destination. And the same thing here, using alcohol. So basically, if you're sitting there as the chief of staff and you're saying, well, they have to be running out of, aviation fuel, you're absolutely right. They are. But now Ultra is revealing that they are, basically getting blood from a stone, that they are dealing with pine root and they're using alcohol. So in other words, now suddenly, even though you're cutting off their oil, they have found other ways and means that they will be able to support a kind of, to use a German term, a Götterdämmerung defense, right? The big kamikaze, the idea of the divine wind. So this is really chilling stuff, and it gives us a new insight into what is happening, a new understanding of decision-making in all these aspects, because it's perhaps in some cases nowhere near as black and white, and you can see now from a historiographical perspective just how important these files are to our understanding of the Second World War.
I'm already thinking of all sorts of ways historians could spin this information. It's either reinforcing the idea that we should drop the bombs, or it's saying we shouldn't. I mean, the potential ways this could be written about, depending on your point of view, depending on what your aim is with the book. It's kind of mind blowing. And these, as you said, these are just 3 documents you've shown. I'm assuming there's
the body of evidence is incredible. It's incredible, the body of evidence. There's also stuff in there about the sinking of the Yamato, which, of course, they basically just knew was coming on a suicide mission and basically allowed the Japanese to stick their heads in the noose. It just goes on and on and on. I mean, it's if you really wanted to, understand decision-making in general, and particularly in the Second World War, you have to tap into these files. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. This is the gold mine, without a doubt.
Wow. Well, I mean, we've all, myself included, been just absolutely amazed by this. We did say this was going to be questions and answers, and I think that we've, as usual, people have been asking questions, and then a minute or two later, you've been answering them anyway with the presentation. But we'll do a few questions, and then we'll go from there. But it's been a fascinating dive, a shallow dive, because what I'm appreciating is there's a whole level of depth, and I think a Mortan show. Next August could be a potentially good.
That'd be fun. That'd be a lot of fun. No, certainly you're right. It's a shallow dive in a very large pool.
Yeah. So let's start with the questions. So Trent Alenko is one of our resident understandings of the Pacific Theatre and radar and codes. And so Lord Zuckerman claimed in the oil campaign advocates were holding back ultra messages from SHAEF on the success of the transportation campaign in September, October 44. What's the truth in that? I have to say, I don't really know what that question means.
Okay, to be honest with you, I don't know specifically about that, whether they were holding back ultra. That would be very difficult, and you would have to tap into the culture that was prevalent at those various headquarters at the time. There could very well be some truth into that. How much, I don't know, to be honest with you, because I've never really sunk my teeth into that particular aspect. There is a politics of it, but again, the fact that the boss is listening, the boss is getting essentially what you're getting. He's getting the highlights. So you can imagine if you're holding something back and then Churchill sends a query, all hell is going to break loose. So it may not necessarily be that they were holding things back, but rather that whoever was in the decision-making seat was just that powerful to be able to steer in a particular direction. In other words, sometimes you don't have to deny the information, the existence of it, but just either downplay it, ignore it, or, just basically steer the, I've been on plenty of committees where I've seen the agenda of the committee already set up, and no matter what you say, it's, the decision's already been reached, So that could very well be it. I wish I had a little more detailed information on that, but I don't. But again, another great, potential, avenue of inquiry.
Chris, was there ever an instance where the Germans captured ultra documents or information, documents referring to ultra in the field? And if so, did they give any thought as to its source?
Okay. As far as I know, the things that you have seen today, no. All right. As far as we know, I can't think of any other times. There were times when they did overrun advanced communication units and were able to get into lower level codes and medium level codes by the Allies. But as far as we know, they never did that. Remember that everything that you saw today are copies, okay? Like copies at the time that were put into files, because when the messages that you saw today reached the SLUs, the information was brought into the commander. It was logged in a camouflaged way, and then it was destroyed. It was burnt specifically for those reasons, okay? Specifically for those reasons. So I have never come across anything in my research to suggest that anything to do with ultra directly had fallen into the hands of the Germans. Or if they did, they certainly didn't make sense out of it, at least not to this degree.
Another one from Trent. hell did break loose in February
Jesus,
1945
yeah.
when Ike did a "Why Did We Miss the Ardennes" post-mortem. So I
Oh,
guess
poor
kind of,
Trent. Yeah, Trent has done his homework on this without a doubt.
Trent knows his stuff. He's been on the show before, and he'll be coming back again next month. Next month. So Trent knows his stuff. So yeah, do you want to handle that one?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, basically, it's kind of the same as the more 10 idea. In other words, that, yeah, there's a lot of things here. I mean, also, too, there's a war weariness, right? By the time the Germans have collapsed in Normandy and you get into the fall, it's like, oh, for God's sakes, let's get this thing over with. Also, too, there's plenty of finger pointing that's going on. Bletchley is interested in protecting its ass. Not that it did anything wrong, but the Americans are up in arms. So as a result, it comes up with a report basically saying, okay, here's the reasons. And part of the reason was, lack of patrolling, lack of aerial reconnaissance. And then, of course, the fact that each one of the commanders had their own assessments. Some of them were looking for attacks in different sectors. Some of them expected that maybe if an attack did come, it would be limited in scope. But when they started to do the postmortem, and of course, hindsight is 2020, they started getting indications of this in September, where Hitler was promising that in 3 months, things would be back up to scratch and they would go on the offensive again. Now, of course, September 2nd, you don't believe that crap. If you're sitting there saying, yeah, there's no way. There's absolutely no way after the beating they've taken here, the beating they're taking on the Eastern Front, that they're going to be coming out of it. It's just Hitler doing his sales.
It's kind of Mortan repeated, isn't it? That they can't be doing this.
Much. Yeah, in the sense that all the information essentially is there, but they just don't make the proper conclusion. They don't draw the proper conclusion.
We established at the beginning, didn't we, David, that providing information and the evidence doesn't mean it's going to be acted on correctly or with due speed or whatever. It's only it's down to the commanders to then decide or not to decide what to do about it. The information may be good, but the use of it is open to human interpretation, isn't it?
It's ultra, it's wonderful, it's not complete, it's not a crystal ball. And that's the key. It can't predict the future. I mean, we look back and say, oh my God, like we're looking at it today and we're like, oh, wow, imagine if they had acted on this in time. And it's the same thing particularly with the Ardennes. You look back in hindsight and you're like, oh my God, as September turns into October, turns into November, you can see it coming, but you can also see how they miss it because basically they're operating on preconceived notion that there's no way that the Germans are strong enough to do this. In other words, they're talking at the top of their hat. There's no way they have reserves. And as Bletchley points out, nobody was really keeping tabs on those reserves moving into the area and the buildup. And whatever buildup was going on, they were conveniently dismissing it as something that they would like to see happen as opposed to what really could happen.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, think about 9/11. If you're the Bush administration and somebody comes in and says, oh my God, look at all this evidence, 4 planes are going to be hijacked, they're going to be flown into the building, and this is on, September 9th, you're going to be sitting there going, what? What are you talking about?
Hindsight is always
ridiculous. You're going to fly planes into a building? What are you, nuts? Like it doesn't make sense. Now that it's happened, oh my God, how did they miss that? Well, in some cases, that's the same
chilling point.
I mean, the Germans are beaten, according to the Allies. The Germans are beaten, and the only reason that they haven't given in or the war's not over is because the Allies ran out of steam coming out of Normandy, and now they're restocking in the fall. So basically, it's 2 boxers that are beating the crap out of each other, and they're waiting for the bell.
And this is where we must understand as well that Ultra is only part of the information package that commanders in the field are receiving. They're also getting the recent POW interrogations that is giving a different picture of morale. They're seeing things on the battlefield. They're experiencing things. So the Ultra is not the only source of information they're getting.
No, it's not. You're right.
It should trump the information they're getting. But
no, you're right. And that's the strength and weakness, right? There's the double-edged sword of Ultra. As incredible as it is, nothing is going to shake the faith in Ultra other than Ultra. So there's your historical strength and weakness right there, your double-edged sword. So yeah, you could have a bunch of guys in the front line squawking about this. The prisoners of war could be saying, yeah, we're about to attack. But the problem is, unless Ultra is coming in to overturn Ultra, you're not going to get the kind of confidence and reach that kind of consensus. And again, that's the historical fact of Ultra.
We've got a question, Nicholas Patton there. How much did Ultra shorten the war? Because that's the thing you see, isn't it? I mean, I know that's kind of not an annoying. It's a good question, but it's also an annoying question.
It's an impossible question, but yeah, it shortened the war, no doubt about it. I mean, you understand how to hedge your bets, right? War is fought on a budget. You want to stretch your budget. You want to make sure that nothing unforeseen happens. So yes, without a doubt, it's ultimate insider trading. Okay, if it's a stock market, you understand what's about to happen. You understand what what a particular company is going to do, when it's going to do, why it's going to do it. If you have that kind of intelligence, does it shorten the war? Yes, logically, you would say yes, because we have the power of information. Putting a figure on it is difficult. We have said, historians have said 2 years, largely because Harry Hinsley said 2 years. And I think even Harry Hinsley would have admitted, and I think he did somewhere, that he kind of pulled that out of his butt when he was pressed in a conference once to say that. He never really put in calculation, but I think he kind of meant the way I explained it, that yes, it shortened the war, but how much, I don't know. It's just logical that when you have this, that you are going to be much more efficient in your ability to fight and to bring about victory faster than you would have if you didn't have it. I mean, let's face it. Does Normandy happen the way Normandy happens if not for Ultra? And the reason I say that is, do the British dare to enter into an attritional struggle if they don't have something like Ultra, which keeps tabs on the stock of their opponent? Haig never had that in World War I.
That's a really good point,
and
isn't it?
I mean,
David Kenyon established that the Allies had known about I think it was all 57 German divisions. We knew their orders of battle, and so the Allies know what could be put into the field. The Germans, by contrast, have got the Allied estimations all wrong, so that they think there's forces that don't exist coming. So yeah, you're right. There's, in a sense, the Allies have the ability to see the end of the tunnel. The Germans don't know how long the tunnel is or where the tunnel ends. So
exactly. In First World War, you're launching things like the Somme and Passchendaele. You're engaging in attrition, knowing that you are going to write your enemy down, but you don't know how much your starting point is. You don't know what kind of damage you're actually inflicting. You don't know what kind of resources or reinforcements are coming in. In Normandy, you do. So Montgomery can have a relative sense of confidence in engaging in attritional struggle, knowing how much is on the shelf to start with the Germans and how much is in the back stockroom. And he can keep his finger on the pulse of those numbers throughout the entire campaign. So when he is forecasting and saying, yeah, we're going to continue, and it's going to work, eventually it is. He may not be precise to within 2 or 3 weeks, but he knows it's going to, because they're inflicting X amount of casualties on the Germans. They know they start with Y number. They're inflicting X, and they know they only have Z coming up. So therefore, just keep going. It's a beam counters war. It's the abacus war.
You said 2 or 3 weeks there, because one of the questions right at the beginning, I think a couple of people asked this. They asked about Allied failure to understand German forces around Arnhem ahead of Market Garden. Is that we now know that the liberation of Paris to Market Garden is just a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. And so by that time, early mid-September, there, compared to Normandy, where we'd been building up a database about what's in France for effectively a year and a half, and then we're building on that database. By the time you get to the Netherlands in September, I'm guessing the Allies haven't really got that database to fall back on, because the situation has been changing a bit too swiftly for the Allies to build on that picture. Is that kind of a good summary of that, sort of?
Yeah, well, no, to a certain degree, but I think there's something else here that people tend to miss with Market Garden. They understand, generally speaking, what they're going to face up there. They think that they're still relatively under strength, but at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure there's Market Garden historians out there who will jump on this, but it looks like what they did was they factored that in. It wasn't a surprise. They knew they were there. And they just miscalculated and thought, yeah, we have enough to deal with this. In other words, they're not going, because I've seen the Ultra coming out after, and the Ultra coming off after points to the fact that, oh, the Germans restocked those shells a lot quicker than we thought. So, that's basically their attitude. So it sounds like they didn't think that the forces that they were putting in would have the tough time that they did, because they thought the relative strength was actually in their favor, or at least not as bad as it was. They didn't think that the two SS Panzer divisions had restocked to the level that they had. So, and there is an Ultra, there's somewhere in there, and I was looking for it. I couldn't find it for today, but I've come across it, that shows relatively early that the two Panzer divisions are up in that area. And so they know early on, and it's not ignored. I think what they do is they actually factor it in.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, there's a whole separate discussion about intelligence for Market Garden that we could or couldn't do at some point.
Oh, that's another show.
One of the things we addressed in Ireland Week is, with all those cancelled operations, the airborne are going to do something anyway, because they've just had at some point they're going to just do so. Anyway, that's another subject for the day. And I think we should kind of wind this down now. I think we've kind of addressed most of the questions. Trent wants to ask a few more, but we'll do another show later on. But
we can do it specifically with the Ardennes, which would be fantastic. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole show, a spin-off series in this.
But to kind of recap, I mean, and just to bring things to an end, clearly we're historians. There's a lot more information they can pull out of Ultra to formulate books. Yeah. And as you have done essentially, but there's more things that can be done. But for those watching there are some books on Ultra. But going forward, you mentioned those books written in the 1970s. What's being done right now about Ultra? Are there any books, the last couple of years, or books you know of that are being written that are addressing this with this new appreciation of the documentation, or is it out there for someone to do such a book?
To be honest with you, I've been the one kind of urging people to take this step, because I know how valuable historically these documents are, and they've essentially been sitting there. And I always applaud any of the newer works that come out that are drawing on these, and especially ones that are mixing these in, as opposed to simply focusing on Ultra or focusing on something else. The fact that they're working it in as the normal course of the historiography. One thing I will say, I don't know if there's anything specific I can put my fingers on at the moment, but one thing that I will say generally is to get back to what we talked about at the beginning. This is not a white elephant. It appeared to be a white elephant in the early 80s when there was no material out there to support the claims. But now there's millions of pages that have largely gone untapped. And so this really is something. And, if I have a graduate student working for me and he's working on a battle history, he's not passing unless he gets into these files, because it rounds out, without a doubt. And it's some of the most key material that you can use.
I suppose some of the classic books written maybe 20, 30 years ago, by which time there has been information released about Ultra, are tagging Ultra in after they've done their primary research work already. And what you're suggesting is that don't bring Ultra in towards the end of the work, is actually start with Ultra and then build up from that, then go to the war diaries and the after action reports and all that. So use it as the first step as opposed to the last step.
I certainly would argue that, because of the fact it is not a one-way street. It's two ways. In other words, now that you know that the commanders in the field have a symbiotic relationship with Bletchley Park, and they are sending their intentions back, whether it be expressly stated or whether it's couched in terms, you can put together or you can reverse engineer what they're asking for by how they assign their priorities, right? In other words, if you've got a 5 priority going on the Falaise Road, then obviously, somebody's asking for that without a doubt. So yes, without a doubt, I would certainly have that as the, if you will, the spine that goes through the work, because that it is devoid of any ex post facto BS.
Well, I was just going to make that exact point, is that I think it's James Holland said that if you're studying Montgomery's relationship with Patton, for example, if you want to select all the times Montgomery is negative about Patton to make a point, you can. You can also look at all the points they're being complimentary about Patton. It's all about opinions being expressed at the time, and as you say, post-war by some of these people. The Ultra documents, by contrast, are unbiased. They are by the nature. They have been compiled essentially by committee, and they're pure. There's no fluff in them, and so therefore, when we talk about things, not just Market Garden, but Operation Goodwood springs to mind, because books will talk about how Dempsey wrote about it, how Montgomery wrote about it, whatever. And maybe, as we just said, starting with what the Ultra communications, and I'm stressing both ways, said about it in July, might shift our thinking about how some of the decisions were made, that we've made based on, as you say, post-war recollections by commanders.
Fantastic in history, you're always striving to eliminate or reduce the bias. And that's exactly, I would argue, the greatest strength is the purity, if you will, of these documents that literally come from the horse's mouth at the time in question. You can't get, I would argue, a better tranche of documents than you can with these files. And that's why they're so strong and they're so amazing. And to be honest with you, they're a hell of a lot of fun to go through, because that whatever you're working on is extremely important, or what you're looking at, right? It's amazing.
But just bear in mind, in your case, that it could end up spending 15 to 20 years of your life just studying one day battle. So,
it keeps me off the streets. So there you go.
So we will. I just should remind, for those who have found us new with regards to, I didn't mean to put on David there, to find us new with regards to codes and code breaking. David, of course, is the author of several books. There's one about the Normandy campaign with the Black Watch Academy, blah, 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 South of Corps, fantastic book. Then, of course, there's a Dieppe book. Go back, and if you haven't already seen David's other appearances on the show, we talked about Operation Spring, we've talked about Wartime, we've talked about the Falaise Gap, we've talked about various things over the course of the last 18 months or so. So I forget where I put the link. I think there's the link to David's Dieppe book is definitely in the description below. But I think if you haven't got too many other things to do, I think your book on Ultra would be something we would all snap up. I think
that's coming.
Okay, good. Well, brilliant.
Somewhere down the line. It's coming. But it's a series of books. It's not just one. I mean, it's incredible.
Well, it reminds me of when I was talking to Dilip Sarkar the other day, and Dilip's done over nearly 50 or 60 books. He said, I'm kind of slowing down now. I'm just going to bash out a 7-volume history of the Royal Air Force before I stop. And you think, wow, some people spend 30 or 40 years writing a single book. It's going to bash out a 7-volume history.
Volumes.
It's just, some people have very different work ethics than perhaps I do. But anyway, I'll just come back and say goodbye to you in a second. Folks, this has concluded Codes and Code Breaking Week. I'm really looking forward to next week as well, because we're looking at the aspect or the subject of France in World War II. Some really great shows, not just the activities of the French military, but also a couple of battles that took place in France, particularly in 1940. We're looking at the Royal Scots Fusiliers in one action. We're looking at the Royal Air Force in 1940. Michael Nybo is coming on to talk about his new book about the relationship between the establishment of Vichy and the American government. That is an amazing book. That'll be a great show. Cedric Massey is coming on Monday talking about Bir Hakeem. Basically, a fantastic set of shows coming your way next week. As always, folks, check out what we're doing on Twitter. Do consider becoming a patron. Just a few more of you giving a couple of quid a month would help me have the confidence to keep on going through this, because I want to keep on going through this right through next year, the year beyond. But I need your help to do that. So I remind you to do that. Check out David's books. But right now, it just remains me to say thank you very much, David O'Keefe, for joining us. And I will see you again, because no doubt we can do a Mortan show. There's about well, we've got Battle of the Bulge 2 weeks in December, so let's do a Battle of the Bulge intelligence panel. Let's agree that right away.
We got to bring Trent on, man. We'll do that.
We'll put Trent on, because he's good and well, brilliant. So anyway, well, folks, enjoy your weekend. I've got nothing coming up this weekend. I will see you all Monday for France in World War II week. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much, David. I will see you all again on the other side of the weekend.
Bye, guys.
Bye.